Once upon a time, there was a rich man who owned a great deal of land and rented it out to people who paid him in the produce that they brought forth. He had so much land that he didn't even manage it himself, and so much income that he didn't even watch it very closely. Until one day, one of his workers came to him and said, "Boss, something is not right here. Your manager is making a mess of your accounts. Income is down, expenses are up, and I just thought you should know." So the boss brings the manager in and says, "You better explain yourself, buddy. The income is down, the expenses are up, you are making a mess of my operation here, and you cannot work for me anymore if this is how you are going to run things." And he dismisses the manager from his sight. But within a few days, something's different. The income hasn't quite bounced back to where he maybe thought it would, so that's not any better, but people in the community are treating him differently. They're being nice, and not in a servile way, which he would expect as the richest guy in town, but genuinely grateful and kind. And there are even whispers that he starts hearing, "That's the guy who forgave all this debt. What a kind and humane and generous landlord." And the rich man thinks to himself, "I'm not kind and humane and generous. What's going on here?" So he talks to one of his renters. He said, what's the deal here?" And the man says, "I thought you knew. You discounted my debt by 50%. My debt to you was 3 years of wages worth of olive oil, and you must have known that it had been a bad year for us, that prices were down, and you wanted to give us a break, so your manager told me, cut the bill in half. It was really good of you to do that." He goes to the guy, the wheat farmer, tells him the same story. "Guy cut my bill by 20%. Thank you, that was really good of you to do." So finally, the rich man figures out what's been going on. He brings his former manager back in and he says, "You sneaky so-and-so. You gave me a haircut with all my debtors so that you would have a place to land when I got rid of you. And worse than that, you made me look good. So now I can't even go back on these deals, tear them up, and go back to the old deal without looking like a total jerk. If you had been this clever, if you'd been this creative in serving my interests, I never would have fired you." Once upon a time, there was a man who was in debt to a big landowner. He raised olives, he made olive oil, he paid in olive oil, and this year prices were down. But he still had a family to feed. He still had people who were dependent on him. And so the debt accumulated. The interest got added back into the amount he owed, and it just kept getting bigger. Until one day, the landlord's manager came to him and said, "You know what, I'm on my way out here, but the boss will not mind if we have a little jubilee to mark my departure. Just like in Bible times, right, friend? So we're gonna just go and you just go cut your bill in half." Man can't believe it. Not only will it make sense for him to start making payments on the rest of the debt, but he can imagine maybe being able to expand his operations, bring in some more laborers. He can imagine a future that is very different from the one he had in mind just a few minutes before. Thank you, he tells the manager. This is unbelievably kind and generous. And you know, if there's anything I can ever do for you, please don't hesitate to tell me. The manager says to him, it's funny you should say that. I so happen to be looking for my next opportunity. And so if you have anything for me, you know, let me know, because I'm looking. Once upon a time, there was a man who managed the accounts of a very rich landlord. A landlord who was so rich that he couldn't possibly keep track of every last penny that came in or went out of his vast coffers, that he couldn't be looking at the Excel spreadsheets for every single loan. And so the manager, he gave the tenants a little bit of a break, maybe when things were not going great. He maybe made some loans that weren't super likely to get paid off, or investments that had a not so great chance of hitting. And you know what, if in all of this transactions, if a few coins fell into his own purse along the way, no one would even know. And then one day, someone snitched. Someone ratted him out to the boss, and the next thing you know, he's in the boss's office, and the boss says, explain yourself. The manager thinks to himself, what's to explain? You've got more money than you're ever going to spend. You've got more money than you're even going to know you have. And I just used it for a good purpose. So he goes out, dismissed from the boss, goes to the debtors, and he says, you know what, we're in a generous mood today. We're gonna take your bill and we're gonna cut it by half. You owe 3 years' wages worth of olive oil. We're gonna cut that in half. Goes to the wheat farmer, says, you owe 8 years' wages worth of grain, and we're going to cut that by 20%. And, you know, remember, guys, remember who took care of you. Shortly after this, boss drags him back into the office and says, with amazement in his voice, I can't believe what you just did. You used your position in a way that was so clever, so shrewd, that if you'd done that working for me, you would never have been fired. By tradition, this story is called the parable of the dishonest manager, or sometimes the parable of the unjust or the wicked manager, because the word that our translators render here as dishonest would more literally be unjust. But it could just as well be called the parable of the inattentive rich man. Or it could be the parable of the grateful debtors. And this is a challenging parable because there is no God figure in this story. Prodigal son, the father of the prodigal son who welcomes back and forgives his son, he's kind of like God, right? We're supposed to be imagining God when we hear that story. Or in the story of the Good Samaritan, we are supposed to emulate the Good Samaritan who helps the man by the side of the road. We're supposed to understand people being our neighbors the way the Samaritan does, right? In this story, there is no God figure. There's no one standing in for Jesus. There is no hero of the story for us to emulate in a straightforward way. It is not a morality story in the usual sense. The landlord is greedy and also inattentive. The manager is desperate, but he's duplicitous, he's unscrupulous. And the debtors, they don't really do anything wrong, but they certainly don't ask any questions about what is a very dodgy deal just kind of falling into their laps. So there's no one here that we are supposed to model ourselves on in any obvious way. Instead, Jesus is telling his followers something about how we are to view wealth, what it is for, how it is to be used. And this is where the manager has so much insight. He understands more than his boss because he understands that wealth can be used to forge relationships. It can be used to create bonds among people. He can create a bond with the debtors and put them in his debt by forgiving them. And not only that, he can enhance the relationships that people have with his boss by making him look good. After all, the guy has so much wealth that he doesn't work for it himself. He doesn't even manage it himself. He doesn't even supervise the guy who does manage it. It just rolls in. Much better for him to have a reputation for being generous, for being reasonable, for being kind to the people who rent from him, than for him to just endlessly accumulate more wealth. And so Jesus says, if the children of this world, if someone like this manager can be this clear-eyed, and the word shrewd here should not, in Greek, it doesn't have any moral connotation that I can find. So you shouldn't read, necessarily dishonest or cunning into this. Shrewd here means something like practical wisdom, like prudence, like clear-eyed cleverness about the world. That if the children of this world can be so shrewd with the ill-gotten gains that they have at their disposal, how can we afford to be any less shrewd in making relationships with the people who can't pay us back, with the goods that are at our disposal? The wealth itself is amoral. It is not a good thing in itself. The debt of the debtors is not a moral obligation. It's just an accounting device. And so Jesus says, if we can't deploy the goods that are at our disposal with that kind of creativity, with that kind of cleverness, with that kind of insight, with that kind of ruthlessness, what are we even doing here? I think a lot about this line that Jesus uses to kind of summarize and transition out of the parable. Whoever is faithful in a very little is faithful also in much. And whoever is dishonest in a very little is dishonest also in much. I think about that with my work. I think about it with my family. I think about it with time. Because I think we all know this is true, right? We all have experienced how care for a small thing can help us gain a greater appreciation and a greater commitment to the big picture. And we've also seen firsthand, if we haven't done it ourselves, we've seen how cutting a corner here or there over something small that's not important all on its own can lead to discounting, to neglecting the things that really do matter. Cheat a little bit here, and then pretty soon you're cheating a lot more down the line. Whoever is faithful in a little will be faithful also in a lot. And the truth is, it's all little things. We're only here for a brief moment. The hour, the interaction, the money in our account. What is it for? What does it mean to be faithful with that little? Just like the manager in the story, we have this narrow window in which to make meaningful choices, in which to make decisions about the things in our responsibility. And the wealth that comes into our hands and passes out of it is only ours in a very trivial sense. It comes, it goes, whether through our own choices or whether through circumstances or because we die. And the only thing that matters, the only question of any importance, is what have we chosen to do with it? And here, as a congregation, we have a beautiful building. We have a building that is in a reasonably good physical condition, for which I give thanks every single day as a pastor. We have a healthy budget, thank God, for which I give thanks every day. We have the gifts, the dedication, the generosity that we gather together here. And the question is, what are we going to do with these things? Are we going to save them up and hoard them up against a future that may or may not ever appear? Or are we going to use them, deploy them, extend them in order to make relationships with new people, in order to find new ways to serve? Jesus tells his friends today that if you make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, when that wealth is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. And I find this so kind of poignant and so powerful because the word Jesus uses for homes here actually means tents, the eternal tents. I mean, what kind of phrase is that? A tent is, by definition, a temporary lodging. And Jesus says, if you make a wise use of the wealth that comes into your hands by whatever means, those friends can welcome you into eternal tents. And I think the deep truth of this is that everything is temporary. Beautiful buildings, life-changing relationships, money in the bank. It all comes and it all goes. And the question is whether those temporary dwelling places open us and invite us into eternity. The hours that we spend with the Fair Park community face-to-face working with Mount Olive. The time that we spend nurturing children in the faith upstairs during Sunday school. The ways in which we do or the ways in which we could encounter new faces. Invite new people into Christ's banquet. Those are the moments in which the passing wealth of this world becomes a tabernacle for eternity. Amen.